Captain Brown arrived at Minot Air Force Base sometime before June 2012, and although Air Force duty station assignments are short, he was determined to make the most of his stint in North Dakota. Even in places where the cost of living might be less, it can be helpful to pick up a second stream of income, and Brown wasn't going to be left behind. He had his choice of side hustles. He could join the underemployed military spouses and shill wax melts, essential oils, or supplements. But Captain Brown wasn't interested in your average multi-level marketing opportunity. He wanted to sell something that appealed to him, something that might appeal to other men, so he settled on selling children for sex. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. A quick heads up that while Captain Brown was convicted of a variety of sex-based crimes, I have no intention of getting into the weeds with details because that's not helpful to anyone. Minot Air Force Base is about 13 miles north of Minot, North Dakota. Minot has a local population of about 47,000, and the county it sits in, Ward County, has a population of approximately 70,000 people. I lived in Nashville for a couple of years, and I find it really helpful to visualize that the entire population of Ward County can fit inside Nissan Stadium, home to the Tennessee Titans. While he was stationed at Minot as a nuclear missile officer, Captain Leon Brown IV and a local civilian got together and decided to form a local chapter of the Crips gang. Try as I might, I've not found a whisper of the civilian's name or any prosecution they faced. Captain Brown's street name, with the other members of his gang, was Captain. He was the self-proclaimed leader and, I guess, founder of the gang, and he got to decide what the gang's mission statement and values were. Naturally, he decided to focus on drugs, violence, and the commercial sexual exploitation of local teenage girls. The opinions often referred to the sex trafficking of local teenage girls as prostitution. But I think it's important for us to keep sight on the fact that children can't consent to sex in North Dakota, and they certainly can't consent to prostitution. So I'll do my best to use terminology that makes it clear that the victims were, by no means, complicit in their exploitation. With the exception of Brown and Airman Elliott, all the names I used in this episode are pseudonyms. Sometimes I try to describe someone just as their relationship to the facts, but there are so many people in the mix on this one. I really do commend whoever drafted the opinions for keeping all of the initials straight. I needed the crutch of fake names. Also, Brown threw a lot of parties for his gang members and the local children. By using the word children in this episode, I do mean those who are under the age of majority, people who are under the age of 18. I can't promise that everything is in the exact right chronological order because the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals sorted by type of incident and used very few timeline signals. But back to Captain Brown. Brown ran this local chapter? Do we think chapter is the right word for describing a subset of the Crips gang? We're going to go with it. The Crips, in contrast to their primary rival gang, the Bloods, claim blue as their main color. Brown leaned into that, buying blue clothes and bandanas to wear when he wasn't in uniform. How fortunate for him that his Air Force uniform colors were consistent with his purported gang affiliation. Proudly hung on his wall at home, Brown displayed a photo with the caption, "Crips for Life." I will admit I've not done research into the process of starting a local chapter of a gang, but I suspect you already knew that because I don't even know if chapter is the right word. I'm kind of assuming it's not like Greek life with a national headquarter approving charters, but it's entirely possible that I am wrong. Maybe this group in North Dakota was truly a chapter of the Crips. Maybe affiliation was just something Brown asserted to be true. But regardless of ties to other Crips, the organization Brown ran falls under the various definitions of a gang. In what I think was 2012, but very well could have been 2013, Brown hosted a multi-day party at his home, a party he referred to as Project X. At least 4 teenaged girls attended Project X: Gabby, Kate, Christine, and Ashley. Gabby, Kate, and Christine were friends and attended the party together. Christine and Brown had known each other for several months, and he'd invited her to participate in Project X. At some point during the party, Christine walked into Brown's bedroom and discovered him having sex with Gabby. Gabby was brown or blackout drunk and could only remember flashes of the night. What she could remember included being with Brown in the living room, being in Brown's bed, picking her bra up off the floor, and waking in the bed the next morning, though this time clothed. She returned downstairs that following morning and resumed partying. It was, after all, a multi-day party. Her friend Kate helped fill in the missing puzzle pieces. Kate said she and her friends had been hanging out at Brown's house when he returned home with more booze. Kate then described Gabby being really drunk and puking everywhere. She recalled Gabby and Brown seated on the couch and Brown telling Gabby she was really pretty. Kate described the two of them making out before they retreated into the upstairs bedroom. The next morning, Kate saw Gabby in Brown's bedroom, naked except for a bedsheet. Kate said Brown was in the bathroom when she saw Gabby in his bed. Ashley also attended Project X, though she didn't know Gabby, Kate, or Christine before the party. Nevertheless, she described Gabby as trashed the first night. Brown told Ashley that he'd had sex with Gabby and that if it hadn't been for the Plan B pill, he thinks she would have gotten pregnant. At the time of the party, Gabby was just 15 years old. She and Brown, who was 26 or 27 years old, began dating. Brown later confessed to Ashley that he did impregnate Gabby, though not the night of his party. But being part of Brown's circle meant more than just engaging in sex. Ashley also described a time when Brown shared psilocybin in the form of magic mushrooms with Gabby. After ingesting the shrooms, Brown told Ashley that he was scared of her, and that he was scared of Gabby. He believed they were witches in a forest, and that they were trying to eat him. Gabby, who had never consumed psilocybin before, didn't feel the effects of her half of the dose, so she took more. Her trip didn't start until later, when she was in a Walmart bathroom stall. A few hours after her trip began, she was arrested, though the opinions don't disclose the reason for her arrest. Christine briefly lived with Brown and testified that he similarly gave her shrooms on at least 5 separate occasions. Sometime after Project X, around the middle or end of 2013, another girl, Faith, attended a party at Brown's home. She'd been drinking when she asked him, what it would take to get into his gang. Brown had developed the initiation system. He came up with the rituals and directed the gang's activities. He told her male initiates had to get beaten up. They had to get jumped into the gang. Brown told Faith the only way past initiation for a girl was to sleep with 3 men in the gang. She agreed. Well, as much as a literal drunk child can agree to something like that. Brown and 2 other gang members took her upstairs. Brown continued a relationship with Faith after initiating her into his gang. When she later became pregnant, he told others he facilitated terminating the pregnancy. Brown now contests this, claiming the sole clinic that provided abortion care had no record of Faith visiting. A year after the Project X party, Brown hosted another party at his home. Both Faith and her brother Jason attended the party, where Brown exclaimed to others at the party that Faith was great in bed. Jason told Brown that Faith was just 14 years old. Brown claimed surprise upon hearing this because he said he thought Faith was 17 years old, given her supposed skills in the bedroom. For those following along at home, 17 is still under the legal age of consent in North Dakota. In the military system, though, the age of consent is 16. But it's not exactly like Brown made a habit of asking girls their age. Christine also thought Brown's surprise didn't make much sense. She had introduced Brown to Faith, and she had told him Faith's age. Nevertheless, Brown disputes this description of events, saying it makes no sense that Jason didn't try and fight him. He claims Jason's description doesn't make sense because he didn't report Brown to the police or to his parents. Jason, who was at a house party where there were drugs and alcohol and sex with minors, didn't report his attendance to his parents, and we are supposed to believe that is shocking. As my introduction hinted, it wasn't enough for Brown to engage in sex acts with children. I have a lot of negative opinions about pop culture making pimping something to aspire to, but here we are. Brown facilitated the commercial sexual exploitation of Christine and at least 2 other people, though the opinions heavily imply it was more than just the 3 of them. Christine testified to specific incidents when Brown sold her for sex. Jason, Faith's brother who didn't report his attendance to a very illegal party to the police or to his parents, discussed the gang and the prostitution ring the gang ran with Brown. Jason said there were girls ranging from 15 to 21, and that the gang charged more for younger girls, ranging from $300 to $800. Brown, ever cognizant of the military's age of consent, bragged only about trafficking 16 to 21-year-olds. It sounds like Brown had a colleague with the street named Nona, who helped him run the prostitution ring. Nona might have been what's commonly referred to as a bottom, though Brown and his second in charge originally approached Tanya to lead the prostitution ring. Tanya declined. Men paid Brown directly, and he kept 70% of the money he received for sex acts. Ashley and Brown also maintained some kind of dating or quasi-dating relationship that ended in 2013 when Ashley was around 17 years old. Prior to their relationship ending, Brown really trusted Ashley, and perhaps he was aware that holding multi-day ragers, plying children and men with drugs and alcohol, was not the most safe way to keep track of his things. Whatever the motivation, Brown gave Ashley his social security card, birth certificate, blank checks, and spare car keys to hold onto at her house. I'm familiar with human trafficking, and I've only ever heard of traffickers taking identifying information to hold and use as leverage before. I've never given much thought to where they store their own sensitive items. Brown wasn't afraid to spend that money he was bringing in on Ashley. He bought her a ring, pipes, and bongs, and provided her with marijuana. When Ashley and Brown ended their relationship, Brown demanded Ashley return his, quote, stuff. But Ashley blocked Brown on her phone, so she wasn't getting his text messages. Text messages that read, "Give me my stuff back, please," and "I'm trying to be nice." But the pleasantries quickly faded, and Brown warned Ashley not to test him. When Ashley still didn't respond and comply with his demands, Brown threatened to withhold drugs and to use every resource he had to bend her to his will. He told Ashley he hated her and that they were in a war. He again demanded the return of his things, including the ring he bought and gave to Ashley. I don't know anything about North Dakota law and gifts, but Emily Post would let everyone know that demanding the return of a gift is in poor form. But Brown's threat to send girls to beat up the recipient of a gift to ensure its return is notably worse. Ashley's mom collected the bag of Brown's personal documents and items and returned them to him, but Brown wanted that ring. When it wasn't included in the bag of returned items, allegedly, someone kicked in a basement window, climbed the stairs to the first floor, proceeded up the stairs to the second floor, and searched Ashley's room, leaving it open when she would always pull it shut to keep her cats out. Perhaps it was Brown, perhaps it was someone acting at Brown's direction, perhaps the window broke on itself and Ashley forgot to close her door. We'll never know. In the months that followed that incident, Ashley was arrested by local police for possession of marijuana. But breaking and entering wasn't a one-off thing. In their spare time, members of Brown's gang would rob people and break into schools. At one point, they broke Christine's window, or probably more accurately, Christine's parents' window. Brown himself described the gang's main activities as drugs, prostitution, and burglary. I gave the context of Ward County's population earlier, in that the entire population could fit into the football stadium in Nashville, because I was naive enough to think that a population that small couldn't possibly support a gang. While there are 15 high schools in the county, there are only approximately 3,700 high school students. Of those, let's assume half are female. 1,850 high school girls. This is not a community where it's easy to go unnoticed or to be nameless and faceless. If the men engaging in sex with these children at Brown's house, at Brown's parties, didn't know at least some of their parents, I'd be legitimately surprised. I read in a few spots that civilian authorities initially approached the Air Force Office of Special Investigations in January 2012, and that Brown's squadron commander suspended Brown's mission-ready status and cut off his access to sensitive materials. You know, like materials related to the nuclear missiles he worked with. His command transferred him to the 91st Missile Wing Safety Office while he was under investigation. The reason I'm concerned about that particular nugget of information is that January 2012 was squarely before many of the charged incidents. Brown wasn't placed into pretrial confinement until January 13, 2014. The articles that gave the January 2012 information are near exact copies of one another, though, so I'm not sold on that January 2012 data point. When his actions finally caught up with him, Brown initially blamed his roommate, Michael, for calling law enforcement. Ashley testified that Brown either had a hit or wanted to order a hit on Michael for this betrayal. Another airman overheard Brown saying he was looking to find or pay someone to beat Michael up. A jailhouse informant corroborated all of this, saying Brown put out a bounty on Michael, but the informant wasn't sure about the motivation. He thought maybe it was because Michael owed Brown money. Last, but certainly not least, Airman Derek Elliott, a friend of Brown's, explained that Brown approached him and offered him $5,000 to put Michael in the hospital. The offer wasn't good just to Airman Elliott. It was good to anybody up to the task. Prior to his trial, it's alleged that Brown tried to get either marijuana or cash to Ashley in order to incentivize refusing to testify against him. On the other side of the coin, if she refused the offer of drugs or money and testified against him, he threatened to beat her up too. While Brown was in pretrial confinement, Airman Elliott was in post-trial confinement for marijuana distribution and steroid use. During that time, Airman Elliott recorded some of the conversations they had at the jail. Airman Elliott also got recordings of Brown making threats against one of the prosecutors and one of the special agents. Brown claims he made those threats to the special agent and to the prosecutor as a joke. Further, Brown asserts that Ashley, an airman that overheard him, Airman Elliott, and the separate jailhouse informant had it wrong and someone else had threatened Michael. Brown made what I think was the right decision and opted for a court-martial by judge alone. I don't think this was the set of facts to go to a panel with. The military judge found Brown not guilty of 3 specifications of rape, conspiracy to pander, distribution of methamphetamine, heroin, Vicodin, ecstasy, and lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. Not guilty of 2 specifications of sexual assault using an intoxicant, 1 specification of conduct unbecoming for organizing minors to have sex for hire, multiple specifications of obstruction of justice, and at least 1 specification of communicating a threat. If you got a little queasy hearing the laundry list of acquittals, stay with me. The judge convicted Brown of providing alcohol to minors, wrongfully distributing marijuana, wrongfully distributing psilocybin, wrongfully consuming psilocybin, multiple specifications of sexual assault including of a minor, those are the lesser included offenses for the rape charges, multiple specifications of communicating a threat to multiple victims, human sex trafficking, breaking and entering, wrongfully threatening to kill multiple members of the armed forces, and conduct unbecoming for running a violent gang. The judge sentenced him to dismissal, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 25 years. He received 60 days of pretrial confinement credit. In his first appeal, Brown argued that all of his convictions, except a few convictions related to drugs and alcohol and the threats he made to Ashley, were legally and factually insufficient. I admit it's kind of nice finding opinions where the appellant argues factual insufficiency, because the opinions are very fact-heavy and easier to pull details from. On the other hand, I don't think it requires much creative lawyering, but I have accepted that sometimes that's the only argument. I imagine the opinions are pretty satisfying to write. They have to review the entirety of the record in order to make sure that they got all of the details on whether or not something was factually or legally sufficient. I guess my practical tip for prosecutors would be, make it really easy for your appellate court and write a very strong closing argument. That seems the most natural starting point to get a sense of the case against the accused and where to dig in first. In addition to arguing insufficiency, Brown also argued that the government failed in its discovery obligations, that he had ineffective assistance, and that he should have received more than 60 days of confinement credit. Finally, he asserted a series of unfair post-trial delays. Brown argued that, with respect to the charges around sex with Gabby and Faith, both children under the age of 16, no one actually testified to witnessing penetration. He further asserted that Christine was not credible and that Kate's testimony also lacked credibility. But Kate's testimony was pretty in line with Gabby's testimony and Ashley's testimony, so I don't think it's reasonable to just toss it out. Brown also contested the conviction he sustained for conduct unbecoming, the one he got for organizing a violent gang. This, in spite of the photo, the gang colors, the jailhouse confessions he made to other inmates. He challenged the appellate court to sort the wheat from the chaff, to determine whether he was actually in a violent gang or whether he was just bragging and telling stories to impress teenaged girls and other Air Force inmates. Ultimately, the only conviction the AFCCA set aside on the first appeal was the conviction for unlawful entry into Ashley's mother's house. They weren't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that a busted window and a suspiciously open door, in combination with the text messages Brown sent Ashley, that Brown was guilty, either as the perpetrator or as the principal. Let's briefly talk about Brown's ineffective assistance of counsel claim. He alleged that both his privately retained civilian defense counsel and his detailed military defense counsel were ineffective in 3 ways. He claims they, first, failed to adequately challenge the testimony of key witnesses, including Christine, Ashley, Airman Elliott, and another jailhouse informant. Second, that defense counsel failed to object to bad evidence and introduce good, supposedly exculpatory evidence. And third, that defense counsel failed to properly investigate the case and make appropriate Freedom of Information Act requests. These 3 categories of failures, Brown asserts, significantly prejudiced him. I've talked about the effective assistance of counsel before, mostly through a procedural anomaly in episode 13, the Witt case. As a very brief overview, the Sixth Amendment guarantees criminal defendants the right to effective assistance of counsel. The baseline presumption is that defense counsel was effective unless proven otherwise. Tactical decisions aren't subject to second-guessing by appellate courts unless the tactical decisions were unreasonable under prevailing professional norms. The AFCCA considered Brown's ineffective assistance of counsel claim using a 3-part test. If Brown's allegations against his counsel were true, they would look to whether there was a reasonable explanation for the lawyer's actions, whether their performance fell measurably below the performance expected of lawyers, and whether there was a reasonable probability that, without those alleged failures, Brown would have received a different result. An error without prejudice isn't always a significant error. First, let's walk through his assertions about witness testimony. With respect to Christine's testimony, Brown's defense counsel explained that they made a tactical decision not to confront Christine with slightly contradictory statements she made. They feared confronting her with the statements would in fact only serve to highlight the ways in which Brown broke the law. Brown also balked at the fact that his attorney hadn't confronted Ashley with a statement she'd made during what I assume was an investigative phase of the case, where she denied any romantic or sexual involvement with Brown. Again, Brown's defense counsel explained that this was a tactical decision. Squabbling over their relationship status would only serve to put a spotlight on a 27-year-old commissioned officer pressuring a 16 or 17-year-old into sex in exchange for marijuana. It was either a romantic relationship or a sex-for-drugs arrangement, and defense counsel believed that drawing that spotlight would be a bad tactical decision. There's additional information about Airman Elliott and the jailhouse informant's motivations, but the AFCCA ultimately concluded that Brown never demonstrated that his counsel behaved unreasonably with respect to those witnesses. Defense counsel were diligent and dogged, and the decisions they made resulted in Brown's acquittal for many of the serious offenses he was charged with. Even if his counsel had been ineffective, the court concluded, Brown wouldn't have obtained a more favorable result at trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Next, let's look at Brown's allegation that his attorneys mishandled exculpatory evidence. Brown said there was a disk with hundreds of pictures and text messages that his counsel lost, so the judge couldn't adequately assess Ashley's credibility. Defense counsel explained that they hadn't created the disk. The government produced the pictures and the text messages to the defense team, and even if they had lost the disk, they could get a new copy. Further, they'd reviewed the pictures and text messages and made the decision not to introduce them. The communications between Brown and Ashley drew that same spotlight to the wildly inappropriate and illegal dynamic between a 27-year-old drug-dealing pimp and a 16 or 17-year-old girl. Brown also claimed on appeal that the jailhouse recordings should have come in their entirety, and that his counsel failed him by not introducing the entirety of the recordings. He believed the recordings should come in because in them he denied having sex with Gabby and denied knowing that Faith was just 14. He believed that had the judge heard them, she would have been able to appropriately gauge just how much was exaggeration and bravado. He said he was just bragging to the junior personnel he was confined with. In contrast, his defense counsel called the recordings one of the most significant problems they faced in defending Brown. He shared all sorts of details about his conduct, used gang and racial terminology, called his command, legal office, and the witnesses against him foul names, and talked about previous uncharged conduct that he'd only received non-judicial punishment for. Separately, also in the recording, Brown described wanting to become an attorney so he can represent organized crime and make a lot of money. I don't think he's the best candidate for the legal field. Defense counsel opted to minimize how much of the recordings came in, a strategic decision they believed was in Brown's best interest. The AFCCA similarly concluded that defense counsel behaved reasonably in their strategic decisions, and that even if their strategy was unreasonable, Brown couldn't demonstrate that he would have received a more favorable result if the judge had read more of the text messages setting up drugs for sex or heard more bragging from Brown. Lastly, Brown asserts his attorneys didn't properly investigate the case. In his spare time during his confinement, he dug up a Facebook post from Christine that called Brown a good roommate, a time during a sexual assault investigation that Christine denied, then admitted voluntarily having sex with an associate of Brown's, information on Ashley's marijuana possession arrest, and information on Airman Elliott's arrest. He believed the things he uncovered challenged everyone's credibility and that his attorneys should have done the legwork. In response, defense counsel detailed what their investigation looked like, which the court determined was reasonable. For other reasons related to the conditions of his pretrial confinement, the AFCCA granted Brown 1 additional week of confinement credit. Because they vacated the conviction for breaking into Ashley's house, the AFCCA conducted the sentence reassessment themselves and sentenced Brown to a dismissal, forfeiture of all pay and allowance, and confinement for 24 years and 9 months. Brown later renewed his appeal, centering his novel assignments of error on Nona. Nona never testified at trial, but in the weeks after the AFCCA issued their first opinion, Nona approached Brown's counsel with a declaration. In it, she wrote that she had lived with Brown for 5 months and had personal knowledge of his behavior. Nona denied engaging in commercial sex, denied being in a gang, denied Brown was ever involved in drugs, took responsibility for any drugs found in the house, denied the existence of a prostitution ring, and denied Brown ever engaged in sex with either Faith or Christine. I don't know how credible it is to have a roommate attest that Brown never had sex with someone. It seems like something she might not have personal knowledge of. Brown himself had bragged about having sex with Faith on tape and maintained, also on tape, that he just hadn't known her true age. I also don't know that I understand the idea of Nona taking responsibility for all of the drugs found in the house when Brown seemed to concede some of the drug issues on his first appeal. These blanket statements really undermine her credibility for me and just make it seem like she took up the task of taking the fall for Brown. Nona said it was easy for Brown to contact her, and expressed her frustration with not being contacted prior to his 2014 court-martial. Nona claimed she didn't learn of Brown's court-martial until her sister talked about it in late 2016. At the most generous reading, it took her 7 months to come forward with her claims. Brown asserted this new evidence necessitated a new trial and renewed his objections to Christine's and Kate's credibility. The AFCCA denied Brown's petition for a new trial, and that makes sense to me. If it was so easy for Brown to get in touch with this potentially exculpatory witness, I don't see a reason they wouldn't have done it themselves prior to his court-martial. I don't see a reason to wait until the AFCCA issues their opinion on Brown's appeal. I don't see a reason Nona would only learn of Brown's court-martial and conviction more than 2 years after the fact. There were plenty of local stories about it. Presumably her sister, knowing Nona lived with Brown for some time, would have thought it was worth mentioning sometime during the intervening years. Brown appealed this issue to the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, but they denied his petition for review. I know you're ready for me to thank you for listening and drop a snippet about the next episode, but I'm not done yet because Brown isn't done either. Brown filed a writ of habeas corpus in the Central District of California. He's serving his confinement at the federal penitentiary in Lompoc. I'm not sure why he's not at Leavenworth, and most of the sources stated he would be at Leavenworth, but I'm not going to dig too much into that, in part because I don't know how to dig into that. A writ of habeas corpus is a demand to show me the body, which admittedly sounds weird. It's a sort of Hail Mary, a writ to complain that something went wrong and the court should test the reasons for someone's confinement. Brown's habeas petition asserted that he did not sexually assault either Gabby or Faith. The district court denied his petition, and in 2022, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal answered 2 questions Brown raised. First, he asked whether the court-martial had jurisdiction over him. Second, he asked whether the court-martial acted within its lawful power. The AFCCA's opinion was clear. At least 4 witnesses supported Brown's conviction for sexually assaulting Gabby, and, in addition to his boasting, 1 witness actually saw him having sex with Faith. The Ninth Circuit concluded, yes, the military courts had jurisdiction over him, and that they acted within their lawful power. They shot down a Brady argument about Airman Elliott's criminal record and the other jailhouse informants, and a new argument Brown made about the jailhouse recordings. When Brown appealed to the AFCCA alleging ineffective assistance of counsel, he complained that his lawyers should have introduced more of the recordings. In his habeas petition, he again asserted ineffective assistance of counsel related to those recordings. But this time, the error he described was in not moving to suppress what did come in. The Ninth Circuit concluded that defense counsel likely would have lost that suppression motion, and the judge would have heard those statements anyway. To translate, They told Brown to kick rocks. In August of 2023, Brown, whose interest in the law has not waned, represented himself in a petition for extraordinary relief. He believed he was a good candidate for compassionate release from custody. He requested to be resentenced to either time served or 10 years, or, in the alternative, he requested a recommendation for clemency or parole. If those didn't work, he asked to please be assigned a military defense attorney and to certify any questions from his petition to CAF. He believed he was eligible for this extraordinary relief because of that supposed new evidence from Nona, and because he was working hard to rehabilitate while in confinement. Brown addressed his petition for compassionate release directly to Colonel Richardson, the original trial judge. Colonel Richardson now sits as a senior judge on the AFCCA. But the code section that governs federal writs in finalized cases, including extraordinary writs like this one, doesn't extend to military courts. The code requires returning to the sentencing court in order to file the petition, and for that reason, the code can only apply to federal civilian inmates whose writ petitions could be handled by the district court that imposed their sentencing. Last month, in February 2024, the AFCCA concluded they didn't even have jurisdiction to consider Brown's petition because they weren't the sentencing court. The sentencing court didn't really exist anymore. While Colonel Richardson, the trial judge, had imposed the sentence Brown received, she was not herself a sentencing court under the provisions of the statute. The AFCCA noted that military courts really are special, and they really are limited. The court is convened by order to handle a court-martial, and when that court is done marshalling the court-martial, the court expires and sort of fades into the ether like little wisps of administered justice. The AFCCA doesn't have the authority to recommend either clemency or parole, can't detail defense counsel, and can't certify issues directly to CAF. I would expect nothing less than for Brown to further appeal, or to take up the AFCCA's footnoted suggestion that he appeal to the Secretary of the Air Force or the Air Force Board of Clemency and Parole. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we stick with officers but get away from sex crimes and violence against women. Until then, take care. Conduct and Becoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct and Becoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.